7 words, that's all it took. 7 words spoken into a microphone, in front of the entire world, by the most powerful man on the planet. And within weeks, the United States was hemorrhaging billions of dollars it didn't even realize it was about to lose. The crazy part? The people feeling it most had no idea where it was coming from. No idea that a single press conference, a single throwaway line, had quietly set their wallets on fire. Stick with this, because what actually happened behind the numbers is far stranger and far more costly than anything the headlines told you. It was January 2025 at Mar-a-Lago. Reporters crowded around, cameras rolling, and Donald Trump, President of the United States, looked directly into those cameras and said about America's single largest trading partner, "We don't need anything they have." Canada. He was talking about Canada, the country that, at that exact moment, was sending 4.4 million barrels of oil across the border every single day. The country supplying over a quarter of all lumber used to build American homes. The country so deeply wired into the U.S. auto industry that a single car part can cross the border 6 or 7 times before a vehicle rolls off an assembly line. Trump didn't stop there. Weeks later, speaking to global elites at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, he doubled down. "We don't need their cars. We don't need their lumber. We don't need their oil and gas." The audience sat in silence. Economists watching from home started running numbers. And what came next, almost nobody saw coming. Here's what wasn't in the press release. Canada isn't just a trading partner, it's the trading partner. In 2023 alone, Canada sent $418.6 billion worth of goods into the United States. Not to China, not to Europe, to America. Every single day, American refineries were processing Canadian crude oil that made up over 60% of all U.S. crude imports. Every week, American construction crews were hammering Canadian lumber into American homes, at a time when U.S. sawmills were already running at 85% capacity, meaning there was physically no domestic supply to replace it. Experts were direct about this. Professors, economists, industry analysts, all of them said the same thing. The idea that America could just snap its fingers and replace Canadian supply was, in the words of one automotive engineering professor, completely untethered from reality. The auto industry alone had spent 60 years building an integrated supply chain across both countries. You don't dismantle that with a press conference. But the tariffs were already coming, and the bill was about to land. February 1st, 2025. Trump signed the executive order. 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian energy. The kind of move that sounds clean on paper and turns into chaos in practice. By March 4th, the tariffs were live. Canada's response came the same day. No delay, no diplomacy. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced 25% retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of American goods entering Canada. Provinces didn't wait for federal permission. Nova Scotia immediately doubled commercial toll costs for U.S. trucks crossing its borders. Ontario's premier threatened to cut off electricity exports to neighboring U.S. states entirely. Electricity that millions of American households depended on. And in Washington, the Republican Party started cracking. 4 Republican senators, Collins, Murkowski, Paul, and McConnell, crossed the aisle and voted with Democrats to repeal the tariffs. The measure passed the Senate. It still wasn't enough to stop what was already in motion, but the financial damage? That was only just beginning. Let's talk about what this actually cost ordinary Americans, because this is the part that got buried. Lumber tariffs climbed past 35%. The result? Building a new home in America became up to $10,000 more expensive. Not for luxury houses, for average homes. Builders across multiple states started stalling projects. Families waiting on new construction watched timelines stretch and prices balloon, with no explanation given on the evening news. General Motors quietly disclosed in its earnings report that Trump's tariff policies had wiped out $1.1 billion from a single quarter's profits. Rather than pass those costs to consumers and risk drawing the White House's attention, GM absorbed the hit. Stock dropped, investors panicked. The Yale Budget Lab put out a report that cut through the noise. The average American household was set to lose $1,200 in purchasing power that year. The following year, $2,000. Economists at CEPR modeled it further out. By 2028, if elevated tariffs held, U.S. real wages would fall 1.4% and GDP would shrink by roughly 1%. That is not a rounding error. That is the largest effective tax increase on American consumers since 1993. And the worst part? Most Americans had absolutely no idea it was happening. While American households were quietly absorbing costs they couldn't name, Canada was executing a response that didn't involve a single missile or threat. Just cold, deliberate economic withdrawal. Canadian tourism to the United States collapsed. Not dipped. Collapsed. 33% down year over year. 6 straight months of steep decline. Border crossings by car fell 38% in May alone. Air travel between the two countries dropped 22%. Canadian tourists had been spending $20.5 billion annually inside the United States, in hotels, restaurants, theme parks, airports, shops. A 10% reduction in that spending alone, according to the U.S. Travel Association, would threaten 14,000 American jobs. The actual drop was more than 3 times that. Meanwhile, Canadian consumers were pulling American products off their own shopping lists with a discipline that stunned analysts. Shelves in Canadian liquor stores were stripped of California wine and Kentucky bourbon, not by supply issues, but by choice. Grocery shoppers were reading labels, choosing Canadian ketchup, leaving American dog food on the shelf. When the numbers came in, Canadian spending on U.S. goods had fallen by roughly $60 billion compared to the decade-long average. $60 billion. Gone. Not because of a policy, because of 7 words at a press conference. What happened inside Canada politically was something nobody in Washington had wargamed. The mockery backfired in a direction no one predicted. Behind closed doors, Trudeau had already told business and labor leaders something chilling. Trump's goal, in his view, wasn't really about trade deficits. It was about collapse. What he wants, Trudeau said, is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us. That warning, quiet, private, and deeply alarming, lit a fire under the Canadian electorate. When elections came in the spring, Canadians didn't just vote for a new government, they voted as a statement. Mark Carney, a former central banker who built his entire campaign around standing firm against Trump, won the prime ministership. The conservative candidate Pierre Poilievre, who had been the frontrunner for most of 2024 and was seen as more accommodating to the White House, didn't just lose the election. He lost his own seat in Parliament. 2/3 of Canadians, according to polling, now view the United States unfavorably. A year earlier, that number was 1 in 4. The country that had been America's closest friend on earth had turned, and Carney stood before the nation and said it plainly. The 40-year era of deep integration with the United States was finished. Canada would find other markets. It was done depending on one neighbor. There's one piece of this story that almost never gets mentioned, and it might be the most consequential of everything. Canada is home to the only rare earth metals processing plant operating at commercial scale in all of North America. Rare earth metals aren't optional. They go into fighter jets, missile guidance systems, electric vehicles, semiconductors, the backbone of both the U.S. defense industry and its tech economy. China controls the global supply chain for these materials, and for years, having Canada next door was America's insurance policy against that chokehold. The trade war put that access in direct jeopardy. At the same time, the economic pain the tariffs were causing inside the United States remained almost entirely invisible to the people living it. Analysts described it as a hidden tax, absorbed silently by corporations protecting margins, passed through in ways consumers couldn't trace back to a single source. The Canadian hurt was visible. Layoffs in Ontario auto plants, export numbers crashing, businesses shutting. The American hurt was diffuse, disguised, spread thin enough that nobody could point at it and say, "That's the bill." Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada James Blanchard called the relationship between the two countries the worst in modern history. Not the worst in recent years, the worst in modern history. And it all started with a man at a microphone who said 7 words he clearly believed, but perhaps never fully thought through. When you mock the thing propping you up, you don't just risk losing it. You risk not even noticing it's gone until the damage is already done. That's the story of 2025 that most people will read in history books and say, "How did no one see that coming?" Some did. They just weren't the ones holding the microphone. If you found this worth your time, a like or a subscribe costs you nothing, and it means everything for keeping this kind of work going.